Let's pray. Heavenly Father, use your word to show us what we're hiding, even from ourselves. Use it to show us that we don't need to hide in front of you. And show us the rest you have for us in Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. Good morning. What are you doing here? That's the question that God asked Elijah on the mountain twice. And maybe how you feel about that question depends on the word emphasis. You know, like, what are you doing here? That's okay. But what are you doing here? That feels a little different. And it's sort of a multi-level question, too. There's just, what are you doing here? Like right now. You know, not much, right? But also, what are you doing here? Like on this planet? What's your purpose? It's a bit like the question, what do you want? You ever thought about how important that question is? I mean, when you answer, what do you want? You're really answering something core about yourself, your identity. What do you want? But most of the time, when you answer the question, what do you want? You probably say something about French fries, right? Which in my case does reveal something deep. I do want French fries. For the next several weeks, we are going to be talking about prayer through the lens of the Old Testament and understanding how Elijah and Israel got to this moment that we just heard is important. So I'm going to roll back a bit to pick up the story. And by a bit, I mean the beginning. I am going to recap the events of the Old Testament. So if you're on the outside of a road, there are going to be people on the inside that are trying to leave. So if you can just kind of let them by, it'll be fine. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first line. Nobody's surprised. But almost immediately, we get an answer to the on this planet version of what are you doing here? God made humanity in his image, according to his likeness, so that we could rule his creation. God spoke everything into existence except for us, which he formed with his hands, and he breathed life into humanity. We represent the Creator in creation. Adam and Eve start out in Eden, a place of God's presence, and they have a responsibility of stewardship for it, a mandate to spread the blessing of Eden everywhere they can reach. What are you doing here? They knew exactly. But almost immediately, the what do you want question becomes a problem. Because humanity, given the authority and ability as images to shape the world around them, says, you know what? Nothing's really stopping me from shaping the world to best suit me, personally. But of course, the problem is God has every perspective, and so his plans are perfect, but we each only have one perspective. And what's optimal for me is a little less than optimal for you. And as we each pursue our own personal optimality, we slide away from our mandate and from each other. We're each seeing and taking what we think will bring us life and unleashing death on each other. I heard my son, who is 8, yell at his sister, who is 4, "When did you decide to aggravate me all the time?" And she yelled back, "On the first day." On the first day of what? On the first day of my life. Which is exactly right. She is wiser than she knows. Our selfishness fractures the king-steward relationship between God and humanity, and without humanity fulfilling its role, creation fractures too. And in this dark moment, God acknowledges humanity's lack of commitment to him, but he doubles down on his commitment to humanity. He promises a solution, a future human that will restore what has been broken. And the rest of this story is just looking for that person. But it's going to be a minute. things are deteriorating quickly. Just a few pages in, and God sees humanity spreading over the earth and wreaking havoc as they go. Their thoughts are only evil all the time. So to prevent creation from being entirely destroyed, he sends a flood to wipe out humanity, almost. There's Noah. His name means rest, and he walks with God. God preserves Noah and his family through the flood. And for 40 days, they bob like a cork on an endless ocean. The only survivors of the most catastrophic event that has ever or will ever occur on the earth. Here's an artist's rendition of this terrible disaster. It was also kind of a fun time, I guess. I don't know. I don't really see that in the text, but. So humanity is saved. So Noah is the promised solution, right? Well, no. The world dries out, but Noah doesn't, and some things get strange with his kids, and we're going to have to keep waiting. But God does once again give the blessing, the mandate that as God's image, we have a responsibility to creation and to each other. Now, Noah's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson is Abraham. God gives Abraham a personalized version of the blessing for humanity. God says that through Abraham's family, all families on earth will be blessed. We're getting closer to that promise from page 1 already. So let's give it a minute. We'll check back in, say, 800 years or so, and it's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is that Abraham's family has grown to the size of a nation, but the bad news is they are all slaves in an even bigger one, Egypt. So Moses, a descendant of Abraham, an Israelite who escaped Pharaoh's death order for Israelite babies, this is what they were living in, he ends up growing up in Pharaoh's household. And he gets into an altercation, and he kills an Egyptian. And so fearing for his life, he goes to hide out in Midian, which is sort of the right city of Egypt. It's like, way out there, and some people own sheep. And that's what he did. He owned sheep. And we'd been there 40 years. God does something he hasn't done up to this point in the story. He tells Moses his name, Yahweh. Now, we don't know exactly how it's pronounced because later Israelites would so revere this name that they wouldn't say it aloud. That's still true for many modern Jewish people. Even in our English Bibles, we have a tradition of not writing it out. Every time you see capital L-O-R-D in your Bible, that's the personal name of God, Yahweh. It means I am. If you ask God, who are you? He would say, I am. There's no useful comparison. God is, unlike anything else is. And so Moses, a bit reluctantly, agrees to join God in a rescue plan for his people. Now, that is a big and well-known story, which I will summarize like this. It worked. God's people are free from Egypt and have gathered at the base of Mount Sinai. And at this mountain, God tells his people that while the whole earth is his, they will be his special possession. A kingdom of priests that will represent God in a unique way to the rest of humanity. The promise of Abraham is coming true. God's presence, which we have been separated from since Eden, is on top of this mountain. It has the appearance of a consuming fire. And Moses is invited up the mountain, and he walks into the cloud of the presence, and he's there for 40 days, which is long enough for the Israelites to start to wonder if he's coming back. So they do what you would do. They melt their earrings down to make a god for themselves, a golden calf, and decide that it brought them out of Egypt, and they throw it a party. And God tells Moses what's going on at the foot of the mountain, and he says, I'm going to push reset and start over with you as a new Abraham. But Moses intercedes, and God, because of his promise, relents. And Moses does come down the mountain with the law, the famous 10 Commandments and some others too, and the entire nation sets out for a new home. Now, Moses, this has got to be our promised solution, right? I mean, he was told the name. He was in the presence. He interceded. He brought the law. Well, no. On the journey, the people and Moses continue to struggle with hard and selfish hearts, and what should have been a week and a half turns into 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But they do arrive, and things immediately get worse. The book of Judges is maybe the saddest book in the Bible. There are 12 leaders, judges of Israel, and they range from to oh no. None of them are a candidate for the promised future human, and the book ends like this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, which is what the problem has been since the beginning, right? So maybe a king will help. The first king, Saul, does not help. But the second king, David, he seems much more promising. David is described as a man after God's own heart. Surely David is the one we've been waiting for. That is another very long story, which I will summarize like this. He's not. But his son, Solomon, now we're getting somewhere. Solomon, while he's king, Israel is at its peak. It's wealthy, it's influential. Solomon is as wise as any king has ever been. And the temple is built, a place for God's presence to dwell among his people. Surely this time. Well, back in all the things God told Moses on the mountain, there was some fine print, some rules for kings, that they should not amass wealth or wives or horses, especially not horses from Egypt. And in the middle of this description of the splendor of Egypt, we find out that Solomon is incredibly wealthy, has many wives and many horses, and guess where they're from? I don't know if this is the invention of foreshadowing, but it's got to be like a really early example at least. Solomon is not who we're waiting for either. And after he dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne. And almost immediately, an official in Solomon's court, Jeroboam, the guy in charge of Israel's forced labor, because they had that now, he starts a rebellion. And the nation is split in two. And Jeroboam sets up a northern kingdom with a new capital, and he builds 2 golden calves and says the same thing as they said about the first one. Hear your gods, Israel, that saved you from the land of Egypt. And so the northern kingdom goes through a series of kings, mostly because the next king keeps murdering the king before him, until we get to Ahab. Now, as an administrator, Ahab got some stuff done. The borders were secure, there was generally peace, he had some decent foreign policy success, but 1 Kings tells us that Ahab, son of Omri, was evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. He set up temples for Baal and Asherah, gods of their neighbors, and he married Jezebel, a Sidonian princess who was a particularly enthusiastic Baalist. She began a campaign of finding and murdering God's prophets. And then Elijah shows up in Ahab's court, and he says, enough. Not a drop of water will fall in this land until I say so. And that's what happens. There was drought for 3.5 years. And during this time, God sends Elijah out of the country, presumably to avoid getting, Jezebel. And he's out in the wilderness, and God has ravens bringing him food, which is good, but probably gross, right? So eventually, Elijah is led to a little town in Sidon, where Jezebel is from. This is Baal territory. And he meets a widow gathering wood for a fire, and he asks her for some food. And she says, I'm preparing a last meal for my son and I. We have a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and then we're going to starve to death. And to express her earnestness, she says, as surely as Yahweh, your God, lives, this is all I have. Yahweh, not Baal. Faith is crumbling in Israel, and it's taking root out here in Sidon. She's not of the family of Abraham, but she is blessed by them. The promise is still coming true. And Elijah tells her not to fear, and she ends up with a jar of flour and a jug of oil that never empties during the entire 3.5-year drought. And Elijah stays with her. And during this time, her son falls ill and dies, and Elijah prays, and he's raised from the dead. After 3.5 years, God sends Elijah back to Israel to confront Ahab. And it's a showdown. Elijah versus hundreds of prophets of Baal. 2 stone altars are set up with bulls sacrificed on them. Whichever God sends down fire to burn the offering is the real God. And so Jezebel's crew go first, and they cry out to Baal all day long with no effect. And Elijah taunts them a bit with, maybe he can't hear you because he's going to the bathroom, which Bible scholars call a sick burn. But all of their praying and chanting and flailing, nothing happens. And so it's Elijah's turn. And he's feeling confident because he has the entire altar doused with water and a trench around it filled with water, which of course makes it harder to light, but there's a very bad drought going on. Maybe we shouldn't be using water for this. Elijah is betting it all on God showing up in this moment. And so Elijah prays, and he says, Yahweh, answer me. Tell these people that you are God. Show them you are God. And fire falls from the sky and not only burns up the sacrifice, but it burns up the stones and the dirt they're sitting on and the water in the trench. The people see it, fall on their faces, declare Yahweh is God. The prophets of Baal are rounded up and killed, and Elijah prays for rain, and it rains. Ahab rides for his palace, and it says Elijah gathered up his robe and outran Ahab and got there first. Huge success. Elijah has got to be who we've been waiting for, right? Well, Elijah gets there, and Jezebel is not happy. I get the impression Jezebel's never happy, but she's like particularly unhappy about this. And she puts a hit out on Elijah, and he's afraid. And he flees to a town in the southern kingdom and then walks a day out into the woods, and he sits down under a tree and he prays, I've had enough. Let me die. I'm no better than the people that led to this situation. And then he falls asleep. Is this the reaction you expected? I mean, so far, Elijah has, via prayer, made it stop raining, made never-ending breadsticks, raised someone from the dead, incinerated a pile of rocks, made it start raining again, and outrun a horse. I mean, if anyone should have confidence in Yahweh, it should be Elijah, right? I mean, he's so dejected. What's going on here? But maybe you've been in this situation. Well, not this situation, but maybe you've invested a lot of yourself into something. Maybe you've bet everything. And then a setback. You thought you had prevailed. You thought you had it conquered. You thought you had it solved. And then disappointment. It's not what you thought it would be. Maybe you went to college and you studied hard and you graduated and you didn't get the job you wanted. Maybe you keep getting passed over for that promotion. Maybe you've raised your kids to adulthood. You've poured so much into them and they're struggling. And it seems like you can't do anything about it. Maybe you've worked hard to repair a relationship and it fractures again. Maybe it's just, God, I think I'm doing all the right things. Why? Why this now? I think that's what's happening to Elijah here. He's disappointed. He's deeply disappointed. He got to the palace ahead of Ahab. I imagine he thought that Jezebel and Ahab would be deposed or maybe even repent. And we don't know what happened, but those things didn't happen. And the king and queen are still corrupt, and Elijah is on the run again. And what were all the miracles for, God? We're back where we started. What am I doing here? He wonders. Now, a bit of an aside, but does this give any context for your situation? I don't know about you, but when I go outside to light my charcoal grill, I take a match with me. I have never performed a miracle. And I think that maybe if I saw one, I wouldn't have any doubts. And this story tells me that, maybe I still would. Maybe I shouldn't be so hard on myself. But back to Elijah, asleep under this tree. And you can imagine God looking at his servant, desperately tired, desperately desperate just done. And what do you think God is thinking? What's the expression on his face? How does God react? Jen read this for us earlier, and she told me that what she loves about this passage is how our infinitely powerful God meets us in our most fragile moments with gentleness. And he does. Have you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? There's a psychologist, Abraham Maslow. He created a framework that posits that all of our needs are not equal. This is kind of intuitive, right? Some of our needs are more fundamental. And if our fundamental needs towards the bottom of the pyramid aren't met, there's really no way to meet the ones above there. It's hard to make progress on relationships when you're starving, right? And so even though Elijah is ultimately struggling with things towards the top of the pyramid, meaning and purpose, God first takes care of his physical needs. Have some food. Get some rest. He knows Elijah needs this to make the journey that will start to address his higher needs. The journey. 40 days on the mountain. You might have noticed 40 coming up a lot of times in this story. The ark, 40 days, Moses in Midian, 40 years, Moses on the mountain, 40 days, Israel in the wilderness, 40 years. Numbers have significance in the Bible. I'm not talking about some kind of national treasure Bible code. It's just that certain numbers mean things in a cultural context. And we do this too. We think of 7 as lucky, right? And 7 has a meaning in the Bible too. It's associated with completeness, wholeness, nothing missing. 7 of something is all you need. Do you see anything strange about this elevator panel? 11, 12, 14, right? 13's unlucky for us. No one wants to live on the 13th floor. In the Bible, a period of 40 is often a time of deep transition. From pre-flood world to post, from Moses the prince to Moses the prophet, from a people without the law to a people under God's law, from nomads to a nation. And now God is leading Elijah back along a period of 40, back to the same mountain Moses stood on to receive the law, back to the presence. In God's continued gentleness, he's returning Elijah to basics. Before the kings, before the commandments, there was Moses on the mountain in the presence. And now Elijah is led back to that moment, the second person to encounter God on the mountain. And the first thing Elijah receives is a question. How incredible is it that God asks questions? He knows everything. He's not asking for information. He's asking for relationship. What happens when you ask someone a question? Ideally, you listen to them. You are inviting an experience of their perspective. How incredible is it that God wants to experience his creatures like that? What was the expression on his face, the tone in his voice? Elijah, what are you doing here? It's the question Elijah has been asking himself. And he says, I've been faithful. I'm doing it right. But I'm alone. I'm all that's left. It hasn't worked. And God says, paraphrasing, come up here and be with me. And there's this very interesting sequence. Yahweh passes by, and there's a wind that breaks the mountain, but he's not in the wind. And there's an earthquake, but he's not in the earthquake. And a fire, but he's not in the fire. And then there was a low whisper. Some translations call it a still, small voice. And God asks the same question, and Elijah gives the same answer. But something is different because God sends Elijah out again on a prophetic mission, and he goes. I think the difference is perspective. Elijah's perspective is limited, like all of ours. He was disappointed because he was trusting in what he could see, his ability. Remember what he said. I'm not better than the people that came before me. He thought he had to be better than the people that came before him. You probably noticed, but when Elijah prays, stuff happens. He comes on the scene saying, it's not going to rain until I say so, and it doesn't. In this story, the only request of Elijah that God doesn't grant is let me die. Because it's a request that comes from a narrow, Elijah-centric perspective, a request that assumes that if Elijah's zealousness is not enough, nothing is enough. A view so narrow that Elijah thinks that when he is foiled, God is foiled. On the mountain, Elijah sees the power of God, but the presence of God wasn't in the spectacle. It was in the still small voice, a voice that does him the great honor of asking him questions, inviting his perspective, and giving him a new one. Elijah is not alone. God has 7,000 people still loyal to him. 7, complete. 1,000 sevens, much more than enough. A bounty. God is telling Elijah that he is in control. From his perspective, the situation is not dire. When something scary happens, what do the children do? They look at the adults. Are the adults worried? Elijah experiences the unworried presence of God. God is never worried. Through the drought and the wicked rulers and the cycles of moral failure, God can and is preserving his people and preserving Elijah, whether he realizes it or not. Good for Elijah. What about us? Maybe you're thinking, I don't think an angel is going to make me breakfast. How do I find this mountain? Good news. The mountain has found you. Jesus and his disciples are traveling to a mountain. And on the way, I imagine that Peter is thinking about this story and his time with Jesus. And Jesus asks a question, who do you say I am? And Peter realizes that Jesus is finally the promised one, the solution from all the way back in Genesis. Jesus goes up the mountain. The transfiguration, we call it. His appearance is changed. He is radiant. And there's 2 other people there, Moses and Elijah, the 2 people who have stood in the presence of God on the mountain, and they still are standing in the presence of God on the mountain. Except the presence is not a consuming fire. The presence is not a still small voice. It's a man. There is no room in Scripture for Jesus to be another prophet or another teacher. Jesus is the presence of God living among his people, and that is something entirely new. That changes everything. Jesus looks at us, and he moves to meet our real need. He sees that satisfying our pyramid of stacked needs isn't actually going to help because the entire thing is on a foundation that will ultimately fail. Hearts that have inward, selfish perspectives. Hearts that trust in our own strength and will be disappointed over and over. Hearts that are separated from the presence. And when this pyramid of all of humanity's needs comes crashing down, it falls on Jesus instead of us. All the consequences of our sin are on him. He experiences separation from the presence of the Father so that we can have access to it via the Holy Spirit all the time. Through Jesus and his death, we have complete access to the presence of God, the unworried, gentle presence of our Creator. A Creator who slides his hand under our stack of needs and becomes our foundation, so that no matter how many of those needs go unmet, and they will go unmet, the world is broken. Ultimately, we cannot fall. We are in his hands. The mountain has found us. Matthew's gospel says that Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah 42, which I am going to read. Listen for some of the things we've been hearing this morning. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. This is what God the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk in it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. I am Yahweh. That is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. See, the former things have taken place, and new things I declare. Before they spring into being, I announce them to you. The blessing of Eden, the promised Savior, a family blessing the whole earth. All promises are fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is all the things the former people were not. He is a real image of God on earth, real rest, real intercession, a real king, a real prophet. In Jesus, we have complete access to the life-giving presence of God. You know those places called total access urgent care? They're everywhere. That's what you have in Jesus. Total access urgent care. I know that's silly, but you're going to see one and you're going to think about it, right? But maybe you don't feel it. I mean, I'm saying that the presence of God, just like on the mountain, is available to you all the time in Jesus, and that you don't have to strive and struggle and be disappointed, but you do, and you do, and you are. Even though you know those things, maybe you don't feel like you have total access. I don't feel it either. Not all the time. Maybe not even most of the time. But I am convinced that is not because it's not there. It's because I get in the way. The presence wasn't in the spectacle. It was in the still small voice. And I don't always live a life that would hear a still small voice. God didn't drag Elijah up the mountain. He invited him. The Holy Spirit doesn't forcibly possess us and pull our strings. God gave us a role as images of himself, and he's given us authority that he doesn't usurp. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. It is very possible to be securely held by Jesus and get distracted from that truth. Distracted enough that we forget for a little while. Our faithfulness is imperfect, but Jesus's is absolute. And what Jesus has accomplished for us is not based on our faithfulness, but on his. That is good news. That is very good news. When we follow Christ, we belong to him, and his Spirit is in us no matter how we feel in any moment. But how do we cultivate more moments of awareness? Clear our hearts of distraction. Well, a bit like Elijah, I think going back to basics is helpful. First, meditate on this story. Brian talked about biblical meditation. Fill your mind with this story. When we follow Jesus, we are grafted into God's family. This is our story. It reminds us that no force of will, no amount of work will solve our sin or its consequences. And we need to be reminded of that every day. This story shows us trying over and over again, but we keep going back to doing what's right in our own eyes. We've tried all kinds of things. We try marginalizing or eliminating the problem people, but the problem is we're all the problem people. We try living by codes and standards and making rules, but eventually we always serve ourselves first and it unravels. And in absorbing the story of Scripture, two things will start to happen. We will see that this story and this world is not about us, even though we really want it to be. That's what Elijah was shown on the mountain. But we will also see that it is for us. Every word, every square inch points to Jesus, to invite us into a relationship, to give us a bigger perspective. Our hearts must be preached to continually, that Jesus is, in fact, the one we've been waiting for. And this story cries that out on every page. Second, prayer is the experience of the presence. Pray for ears that hear. Jesus used this phrase a lot. He said, "He who has ears, let him hear." Now, everyone who heard Jesus say that, had ears, right? By definition. Jesus is talking about ears that can hear more than the narrow perspective our senses bring. Ears that can hear the perspective of God. Ears that hear the perspective of others. I will admit that most of the time I pray like Elijah's prayer of giving up. I need this. I want that. I've been good. And with my Aaron-centric perspective in the front of my mind, I want the spectacle to come and change my circumstances to something I would like better. And if God actually granted all of my requests made from my narrow perspective, it would only amplify the destructive effect of my personal selfishness. Prayer is powerful. Prayer does make things happen when it joins in what God is doing. And we can't know what God is doing if we're only listening to ourselves. Your will be done, not your will but mine. That's how Jesus prayed. Pray for ears that hear the still small voice. We don't have that kind of hearing on our own. It's a gift. And finally, engage other people, other images. You talk to many people every day. How many of them do you listen to? Really? We are images of God, and when we follow Jesus, we carry the presence of God, whether we're feeling it in that moment or not. If you're not feeling the presence, go be the presence to somebody who needs it. You might feel it together. Remember, it's not about us, but it is for us, and we are for each other. Elijah and Moses left the mountain with a mission of hope for others, and they didn't go and do in order to earn a place in the presence. They went and did empowered by the presence they had been invited into. The blessings we've been given are for the blessings of others, just like Abraham. Jesus summarized the whole story like this: love God and love other people. You can't do one without doing the other. And so what are we doing here? We are walking with Jesus, held by his hand, repenting, turning from our narrow perspective, having faith that he meets our real need and is always with us. And while we walk, we grow closer together and closer to him. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the invitation. Thank you that you would care so much about what you have created, to make promises over and over again to preserve it even when we don't care to. You know what we really need, and you know that we're going to be disappointed, that our stack of needs is going to go unfulfilled because this world is broken. But you came. You came among us. And you gave us a place to rest in Jesus. And we thank you for that. We humbly ask for ears that hear, that we might join you in what you're doing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.